Now that we have login and logout, the ability to change a password, whether you're authenticated or whether you're anonymous and you've forgotten it, and we now have the ability to even go ahead and force people to log in to have access to it, we're going to see the sort of final big step here for using Django Contrib Auth. We're going to make it so that certain pages or certain actions on pages can only be performed if a user has the right permissions. So let's dive straight into it with tests. What I've done is I've loaded in my terminal the config test utils. Now, I've been supplementing some of the tests throughout this with a few shortcuts that I find to be particularly useful. We haven't touched upon them yet because they're mostly in the blog and organizer tests, which we inherited from the last class. But you can see there are a few things that just come up all the time and I don't feel like retyping them, and I'm interested in shortening the amount of time I take to write tests so that I write more tests and more accurate tests. So I'm interested in having my sort of repeated actions handled somewhat automagically. This is also part of the reason why I recommend using Django Test Plus. I find that there's some actions that we do a lot of that benefit from shortcuts. What I've put in front of you on the screen is just that. It is a context manager, so unfortunately you're missing the here. I'm using the Python decorator context manager to turn this function into a context manager. And this function is going to take in a test case and is going to do a whole lot of work. Exactly what's going on is not super important, although you are more than welcome to step through it. It is in your repository, so do what you will. But the whole point here is that it's going to go ahead and pull some information from the test case, go ahead and create a new user using whatever user factory, again, is sort of specified on the test case, and then it's going to yield control of this user after having logged in the user. And it's then, once we're out of that context, we'll then go ahead and log that user out. So what this is doing, this is a little bit like the login context manager that we have previously used in some of our password views. We've gone ahead and we've said, oh, well, we would like to log this user in. The difference is that I'm not specifying a user in advance with auth user. I'm saying, I don't really care who this user is. I don't want to have to save the password on my test case, although you'll note in the code currently on the lines that are 20 lines above my cursor, 20 lines above my cursor, you'll see that if there is a password attribute on the test case, then it will use that as the password, or else it will default to secure password ! So it will try and use that to try and be smart about it, but it doesn't care, right? What I'm saying is I want a user, I don't care what the password is, what their email is, just generate a user and then log them in for me. And then I'm going to go ahead and perform some actions. And as we move into testing permissions, that then enables another context manager, which you will find lower down. So I'm using this simply to get permissions in an object format. We'll talk about what this is once we talk about performance, so don't worry about that too much. But it just takes in a string and it returns an actual query for a permission. But in the meantime, I have this other perm user, which takes in not only a test case, but also a set of permissions. And this way, this is also a context. And we say, okay, well, we're going to use the auth user context. And then once we have that user, we're going to go ahead and assign whatever permissions were passed in, and then yield that test user, and then of course come out of auth user and therefore log this out. So the whole point of this context manager, as we're going to see very shortly, is that we have the ability to say, you know what, I want a user, I don't care about the user's email or their password or anything of the sort, I simply want to be able to say what permissions this user has. This context manager therefore enables us to write some very terse code about our views. As we will see, and in fact, why don't we just jump into it? So the goal of this test is to make sure that we can see the form that allows us to create new posts. And what I'm saying here is that if I'm not authenticated, I expect that I'm going to be redirected to our login page. Now, normally you would probably want to make sure that you're being redirected to the right place, and there's a little bit of a balancing act here. Is that too much of a test? Is the 302 good enough, given that I'm then going to go through and see that there's a 403? So the test will likely catch something in the event that there is a setup problem, but the error that I see may not be as clear as I might want it to be. So one of the reasons you try and follow TDD is that you try and make sure that each and every single little thing you do results in a slightly different error. By skipping that step here, as I modify this test, because I'm not quite able to follow TDD, right? I have to make a fairly sweeping change here. It's easy for me to end up in a position where I have missed what could be potentially an interesting error message. So just to draw your attention to that. But so once we have, this assertion for 302, we then say, okay, well, good enough. Now we want to see what happens if we just have an authenticated user. So again, using our new context manager, I'm just going to get the same URL, and then I'm going to say, well, I expect that because we don't have the right permissions, I'm going to be told that there is a 403 error. I specifically don't have authorization to do that. Finally, I then create a permissioned user with the blog add post permission. And I expect that if I have this permission, then I am authorized to create a new post, a new blog post to be specific. This is the code as it existed previously. There is nothing changed here. All I did was indent this out. You note that I could actually go ahead and improve some of this. I'm calling assert template used several times rather than using the neat subtest trick. So, could go ahead and make those changes, but won't bother. And this will go ahead and enable us to see whether or not we have the right permissions when loading this form. Now, I assume that when we actually post the data for the new blog post data, that this behavior is going to be kept. Generally, we expect that if it's true for the get, it is going to be true for the post. If I were being as specific and as precise as I wanted to be or could be, I might have these same lines of code at the beginning of test create post, but there's a real argument there that that's a little bit redundant. So in the meantime, we simply take our permissioned user and we ensure that we have the permission that we think we need to create a new blog post. And then we have exactly the same test as it already exists, right? So nothing has changed here. It's just to ensure that if we have some blog post data, some tag data, and some startup data, that we are able to create a new blog post with all of that data retained by the end, right? The real change is our context manager. And the truth here is that that's going to be most of the changes here in this sublesson, right? We are simply going ahead and making sure that for the various views that we already had programmed for creating, modifying, and deleting any of the data, whether it's a news link, a tag, a post, or a startup, is now protected using Django's default permissions. So we could step through all of this. We could step through every single time I use these context managers, but I don't think it's worth it. I think this sort of illustrates exactly what it is that we're doing. And so with that said, we can now move into the actual implementation that allows these tests to pass now that we've said, no, we expect the following errors, or we expect this to work only if we have the following permissions. So let's jump into it. I'm going to exit the tests, and I am then going to first move into the future. And now I'm going to load, I believe, let's stay within blog actually, just for fun. And you can see, I've come down here, these are mix-ins from our last class. We'll kind of move right ahead. You can see that what's happened is I've now used the permission required mixin. This is very much like login required mixin. I'm pulling it in from contrib auth mixins. And what it's going to do is it's going to expect you to create a new key here. So you can see that I've gone ahead and created a new instance variable, permission required, and I say if I want someone to be able to access this view, regardless of whether it's get or post or whatnot, I expect that they are going to have the following permission. And this is going to be true for all of these views, right? So if I come down here, post delete, I add in the permission required mixin, and I say, yep, I would like that to work. And the permission required is going to be that I have the ability to delete a blog post. Same thing with post update, permission required mixin. Permission required is that I can change a blog post. And this is going to be the same not only in blog, it's going to be the same for all our startup views, for all of our tag views, and for all of our newslink views. So with that said, I'm going to say these are the changes that we make to the views. It's exactly the same across the board. So let's take a look real quick at how we can affect the display of various links in our templates. So notably, one of the key things we want to do is if these are permissioned views, we want to make sure that users who have the permission can see the links on the HTML pages, right? If they have the ability to create a new blog post, they can see a link on the blog post list that says, yes, I would like to create a new blog post. However, if they don't have that permission, we shouldn't show them a link, because if they then click it, they're going to say, they're going to see something that says, no, you don't have the ability to do this. So showing them that link is somewhat misleading. We should not show them a link to any of these permission pages if they don't have those permissions. So let's take a look at that. So again, I'm going to move into the future. I'm going to use my shortcut to look at the files affected. And you can see that I've gone through and changed all of the detail pages, which is where we were displaying the buttons for updating and deleting a specific startup or a specific blog post or whatnot. And you can also see that I've gone ahead and changed the startup list. Now, I'm going to take the template tag views, as I think they're the simplest and most straightforward for demonstrating this. And you can see that what I have here on line, I believe that's actually line 9, yes, as I'm saying, if the permissions for organizer.change tag and if the user has permissions for organizer.delete tag, then we can show this list. Now, this is a list of buttons, first with an update button and then with a delete button. And so I'm saying I would like to only create this list item if one of these two is here. Now, I only show the actual button if they have that specific permission, right? So here's another if condition that says, yeah, if I have the ability to change the tag, well, then I show this button. Or if I have the ability to delete the tag, then I can delete this tag. So that is our first set of changes. And it's going to look exactly the same on our list view. You can see that I have gone ahead and again on line 9, although again it's listed as 8 below my cursor. There we are, line 9. You can see that it's permission organizer add tag, and if we have the ability to actually add the tag, then and only then do we display the P tags that then have the A tag that allows me to click a link to go to that page that allows me to do that. Now, we could sort of continue along and look at all of the other things. The key takeaway here is that Django is injecting, much in the same way that it will inject user, this permissions object, and that the permissions object allows us to query whether the current user that is rendering this template has these permissions. So we don't have to do any sort of extra work to get these permissions. This will always be accessible. There won't be any sort of strange conditions. We can just work with it from this way going forward simply by calling the perms variable within our templates. And with that done, we have successfully gone and fully protected the HTML interface side of our web application, right? We now have made sure that users who have logged in, who have identified and authenticated, are now properly authorized based on what their permissions are, based on whatever permissions we've given them, either when they register or as we've sort of decided to give them these specific permissions during site management or whatnot. Speaking of site registration and new user registration, that's up next.